I'm lost in your haze where the lights are low, drowning in the depths of your eyes. I'm ready to go. In the shadows we'll find our way. Through the night our love will stay. In your love I'm lost, I'm found. In your heart my home is bound. Forever I'll be yours, you'll be mine. Lost in your haze, our love will shine. In your love, I'm lost, I'm found. In your heart, my home is bound. Forever I'll be yours, you'll be mine. Lost in your haze, our love will shine.
Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today, my guest is Dr. Susanna Soberg. Dr. Susanna Soberg completed her doctoral thesis work at the Center of Inflammation and Metabolism and the Center for Physical Activity Research at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Her research has focused on how deliberate cold exposure and deliberate heat exposure can be used to enhance human metabolism. She is the first author of a seminal study which discovered the minimum thresholds for deliberate heat and deliberate cold exposure for increasing brown fat thermogenesis, which is essentially a mode of increasing heat production and metabolism in the body, and for establishing actionable protocols that can be used outside of the laboratory to improve metabolism and human health. Dr. Soberg's research was published in the journal Cell Reports Metabolism in 2021, adding to a long and important history of research focusing on the role of cold and the role of heat in altering various aspects of the body's physiology, including hormone health, metabolism, and changes in neurotransmitters such as dopamine and epinephrine. In fact, today's discussion with Dr. Soberg focuses on the role of deliberate heat and deliberate cold exposure on metabolism, but it also includes discussion of the effects of cold and heat on things like neurotransmitter production, namely dopamine and epinephrine and norepinephrine, the so-called catecholamines, which strongly impact mood and metabolism. In addition, Dr. Soberg answers many common questions about deliberate cold and deliberate heat exposure, including, for instance, the difference between cold showers versus cold immersion up to the neck versus total body cold immersion, including whether or not going back and forth between heat and cold changes fundamentally the way that heat and cold impact the metabolism, hormones, and neurotransmitter production. And we talk about almost every single nuance and variation on deliberate cold and deliberate heat exposure protocols as it relates to the underlying science. In particular, how cold receptors at the level of the skin are impacted versus cold reception and perception at the level of the brain, and how all of that impacts systems of the brain and body relating to mental health, physical health, and performance. Based on her scientific research and academic training, as well as her understanding and use of deliberate heat and deliberate cold exposure protocols, Dr. Soberg is considered one of the world's leading experts on these topics. In fact, she is the author of a recent book entitled Winter Swimming, which is, I have to say, a terrific book because it breaks down chapter by chapter the different aspects of deliberate heat and deliberate cold into its various constituent parts, including cold acclimatization, the cold shock response, dangers and safeties of cold water, the impact of cold and the impact of heat on various aspects of human health, as well as specifics relating to sauna versus ice versus cold swimming, showers, etc. It's a very thorough read and a very easy and accessible read that, if you are interested in deliberate cold or deliberate heat exposure or both, will allow you to embrace those protocols with the greatest degree of confidence that you're going to obtain the specific endpoints that you're interested in, and to do so safely. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero-cost-to-consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Plunge. Plunge makes what I believe is the most versatile at-home self-cooling cold plunge for deliberate cold exposure. I've talked numerous times on this podcast about the many benefits of deliberate cold exposure. And indeed, today's episode is focused entirely on the benefits and the science of deliberate cold exposure. Plunge uses a powerful cooling, filtration, and sanitation unit to give you access to deliberate cold exposure in clean water whenever you want. As we will discuss during today's episode with Dr. Susanna Soberg, deliberate cold exposure, especially deliberate cold exposure done up to the neck in water, can be used to achieve a number of important endpoints related to mental health, physical health, and performance. I've been using a plunge for more than 2 years now. I can tell you that it makes it very easy to get your deliberate cold exposure at home. It doesn't require much cleaning. In fact, it's very easy to keep clean, which is essential. You don't want bacteria and other things growing in your cold plunge. Basically, everything about the plunge is made easy so that anyone, including myself, can get their deliberate cold exposure on a regular basis at home. If you're interested in getting a plunge, you can go to plunge, spelled plunge.com/Huberman and get $150 off your cold plunge. Again, that's plunge.com/Huberman for $150 off. Today's episode is also brought to us by Maui Nui venison, which I can confidently say is the most nutrient-dense and delicious red meat available. Maui Nui spent nearly a decade building a USDA-certified wild harvesting system to help balance deer populations on the island of Maui. The solution they built turns the proliferation of an invasive species into a wide range of nutrient-dense products, from butcher cuts and organ meats to bone broth and jerky. Their bone broth has an unmatched 25 grams of protein per 100 calories. Several guests on this podcast who are experts in nutrition have pointed to the value of getting at least 1 gram of quality protein per pound of body weight each day. With Maui Nui, that's very easy to do while eating delicious meals and getting it from a sustainable source. If you would like to try Maui Nui venison, go to mauinuivenison.com/Huberman and get 20% off your first order. Again, that's mauinuivenison.com/Huberman to get 20% off. Today's episode is also brought to us by Thesis. Thesis makes custom nootropics, and nootropics is not a word that I like because it means smart drugs. And the brain doesn't have neural circuits for being smart, rather it has neural circuits for focus, neural circuits for task switching, neural circuits for creativity, and on and on. Thesis understands this and designs custom nootropics designed to get your brain and body into specific states in order to do the mental and or physical work that's important to you, such as creativity or focus or clarity. If you'd like to try Thesis nootropics, you simply go to their website, you fill out a brief quiz, and they will design a custom starter pack so that you can assess which things work for you more or less well. And then they'll iterate with you over the course of the next few weeks or months to come up with the ideal nootropic kit for your needs. To get your own personalized nootropic starter kit, go online to takethesis.com/Huberman. You can take that 3-minute quiz, and they'll send you 4 different formulas to try in your first month. Again, that's takethesis.com/Huberman and use the code Huberman at checkout to get 10% off your first box. I'm pleased to announce that I will be hosting 2 live events in September of 2023. The first live event will take place in Toronto on September 12th. The second live event will take place in Chicago on September 28th. Both live events will include a lecture and a question and answer period and are entitled The Brain Body Contract, during which I will discuss tools and science related to mental health, physical health, and performance. And I should mention that a lot of that content will have absolutely no overlap with content covered previously on the Huberman Lab podcast or elsewhere. If you're interested in attending either or both of these events, please go to hubermanlab.com/tour and enter the code Huberman to get early access to tickets. Once again, that's hubermanlab.com/tour and use the code Huberman to access tickets. I hope to see you there. And now for my discussion with Dr. Susanna Soberg. Dr. Susanna Soberg, welcome.
Thank you.
So great to have you here. I feel like I should give a little bit of the backstory of how we got connected, which was that for many years, I've been interested in cold thermogenesis. It was the topic of my senior thesis in college. And I've, of course, followed the popularity of Wim Hof. And we've had Dr. Craig Heller, my colleague from biology department at Stanford, who works on cold and its impact on physiology and sports performance. So for a long time, I've been interested in this area, but there's been a real lack of new, let's say, high profile quality scientific information in terms of how, for instance, cold plunges and sauna, how that impacts human physiology. I know there's been some information out there, but it's been sort of scattered. And then a little over a year ago, I see this paper in Cell Reports Medicine and was immediately struck first of all, the fact that it was in Cell Reports Medicine. I've been on the Cell Press editorial board for a long time now, Cell Press journals are, of course, phenomenal journals. And the title and the content of the paper was directly in line with the sorts of practices that people are very curious about and then are starting to emerge, things like sauna, cold plunges. And there was your name first on the author list. And I reached out to you through social media, and we've done a little bit of live content there together. And I've been tracking what you've been doing in the world in terms of your book and talking about the results in your manuscript and talking about the science and impact of deliberate cold exposure and sauna. And I have to say that it's been a wonderful and remarkable thing to see. And you're bringing so much quality information about this area that for a long time, I think was kind of niche and is now becoming more and more mainstream. So I'm going to start off with a thank you for being here and a thank you for the work that you've done. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about it today. So my first question to get things started is, what is happening when we get into an uncomfortably cold environment? So for instance, if I'm really hot on a hot day, jumping into a cold pool feels really good. But if I'm already kind of at room temperature, I'm a little bit chilly, getting into that same temperature of water doesn't feel so good, right? There's a shock there. So if you could just walk us through what happens when we get into uncomfortably cold water, whether or not it's by way of shower or cold plunge, at the level of our physiology, and if you'd like, our psychology. I think that's a good place for us to start, because I think it will orient people to their own experience if they do that.
Yeah.
And for those that haven't done it, might start to peel back some of the layers as to what the underlying mechanisms of cold are.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's really good to just address what actually happens in our physiology when we get cold. And you can get cold in many ways. So you can just head out for the one that gives you the most potent stressor, which is submerging into cold water. But you could also go outside in the cold wind. That's also going to activate your sympathetic nervous system. So get all these neurotransmitters going in your body, and so your catecholamines. Let's just address that we are taking a cold plunge, for example. So if you are very hot, for example, before you go into the cold water, it's going to feel less stressful, but the temperature difference from your skin to the cold is definitely going to give you a shock, but your core temperature is warmer, and that's going to feel a little bit better. So that's why when people go into a sauna, for example, and go out and into the cold water, they can do it easier than if they were cold beforehand.
Could I just ask you a few questions? So you mentioned the sympathetic nervous system, which for people listening who aren't familiar with that is the branch of our nervous system that's responsible for creating accelerations in heart rate, feelings of alertness. It's accompanied with stress and the stress response, but it's accompanied with waking up in the morning, for that matter. So it's not always about stress. And then you mentioned the catecholamines, which are dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So maybe a little bit later we'll talk about those individual neurotransmitters. But you raise a really important point, which is something I get asked about a lot for people that are curious about using deliberate cold exposure, which is how cold should the water be? And I know it's very hard to give a straight prescription for that, because I think it boils down to what you just said, which is it's really the difference between your current temperature and really the temperature at the surface of your skin and the temperature of the water. So if you're very warm, getting into cold feels good. If you're already cold, getting into more cold feels stressful. Is there any way that we can start to gauge what is the best way to approach a deliberate cold exposure protocol? I mean, should it feel uncomfortable? And that leads into the question of how do we balance the discomfort with the amount of time that we spend in? So for instance, if it's just a little bit uncomfortable, will spending more time in the cold get us the same benefit as getting into very uncomfortably cold water for a very short period of time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I definitely think that this could be future studies on this as well, to really unravel what kind of protocols are the best way, or also for which outcomes, of course. So if the temperature is very cold and you feel that, and you also feel very cold, then you should stay in the water a little bit longer. So I think it's just, you should get uncomfortable cold. So as long as you get uncomfortable cold, it's cold enough, and you get this, what we call the cold shock. So the cold shock is activation of your sympathetic nervous system and these activation of the catecholamines, which you just mentioned before.
Does the shock mean that I'm having trouble controlling my breathing? Is that a good gauge?
Yeah, you can say so, because that's kind of like how we define it. So you hyperventilate, so you have a faster breathing rate. So that increases also because you activate your gasping reflex if you are new to this. But if you are adapted, it kind of subsides with time, with adaptation. So what you can do is that you can train this cold exposure, and you can kind of like get adapted to it. So you don't have this hyperventilating response every time you go out in the cold water. So this is like building up your resilience, building up your adaptation is going to make this shock like subside a bit. So it's always harder in the beginning, but you should do hard things, right? It's not something that you shouldn't think about cold water and cold water immersion as something that is comfortable. It should be hard, because that's the point of it, right? If you enjoy it, then I'm thinking something is wrong. It's not right. You should not enjoy it.
Well, this is an important point that you're making, because I think that many people shy away from deliberate cold exposure because it's uncomfortable in a way that, at least from my experience, is very different than the discomfort of exercise. Because with exercise, for instance, if running hard, running fast and breathing hard is uncomfortable, you can slow down or walk. If, lifting weights is uncomfortable, you can remove some weight or reduce the number of repetitions or stop. With deliberate cold exposure, I suppose you can be sort of halfway in, halfway out of the water, or partially underneath the cold shower, but it's very hard to titrate and adjust the level to, it's kind of all or none. And I've seen, I can tell this by anecdote. I've done some work with military special operations. I won't say which country. This was outside the US. And these are very tough individuals. They're used to going without sleep and doing hard, high consequence, high risk kind of work. And they were asked to do some cold water exposure training. And I was there that day, and it was remarkable. About a third of them just went straight in and just kind of grinded through it. Like they looked stoic anyway to me. There were a few whimpers, no cries. About a third talked a lot and you could tell that they were agitated and anxious, but they made it through. And then about a third of them just simply would not get in past their knees or thighs. It seemed like they were just dreading the whole experience. Some actually didn't go in completely, which was really surprising to me. And you couldn't tell based on their physical appearance or anything else about them. They're all high performers as to who would have this response. So it seems like people vary tremendously in terms of their ability to embrace the discomfort of the cold. Is that, from your studies, is that your experience as well? Or are there these weird mutants who seem to just love going into the cold for the first time?
So some people just feel better in the cold, and some people dread the cold even more. And you can say the more people are pushing the cold away, they might feel the cold pain even more. So they would definitely, people who are maybe the soldiers you just talked about, some of them might be already adapted to the cold. So if they are not scared of the cold, they go out and they embrace the cold in a better way. It could also be that some people have a more sensitive nervous system. And when you are a bit sensitive to the cold, you will, of course, try to get away from it, right? And you will also have the cold pain more, feel the cold pain more if you avoid it. So the more you avoid the cold, the more painful it will feel when you go into it. So, yeah.
You mentioned being outside in a t-shirt versus cold immersion up to the neck versus shower. I think this is something a lot of people wonder about. What are the differences in terms of impact, short-term and perhaps even long-term, between cold showers, cold plunge to the neck, so that could be in ice water or just very cold water, immersion with dunking one's head and then coming up, because obviously people have to come up for air at some point, and then simply being outside on a cold day in shorts and a t-shirt or something of that sort?
So there are different outcomes because they are very different exposures of the cold to your cold receptors in your skin. So the more you can say you cover your body in the cold, which you would do in cold water, because they're, of course, covered totally and the molecules are closer to your skin, you will have a more potent activation of all your cold receptors in the skin. So that one will definitely activate your autonomous nervous system more and rapid. compared to going out in a t-shirt in the cold wind, just go for a walk. But that is also something that's going to activate your sympathetic nervous system, meaning then that you will have an increase in norepinephrine. And you will activate something called the brown fat. So this is a healthy kind of fat tissue that we have in our body. And when you activate that, that's going to increase your metabolism.
Before we talk about brown fat, and I'm so glad you brought it up because it's so much to talk about there. What about cold shower? I mean, obviously cold shower is somewhere in between being outside in the air, cold air, versus being immersed up to the neck.
If we had more studies on cold showers, we would learn more about how does that activate our metabolism, how does that increase our neurotransmitters in the brain, which could also have an impact on our mental balance. So I think that would be interesting for the future. But what we do know is from activating brown fat, and both from rodent studies, but also in humans, is that as soon as we get cold on our skin, we will activate our brown fat. So it is kind of like our first responder in the body to keep our temperature up. So our muscles is like the second tissue in our body. We have two tissues which can increase our thermogenesis. So the brown fat, which is like always like temperature regulating our body, and then we have the muscles, which will secondarily start to shiver, and that's going to increase our temperature in the body. But as soon as you go into a cold shower, you will activate your brown fat also immediately. So it could be good also for increasing metabolism in theory, because we haven't really any studies showing how much does it actually activate the brown fat. So if someone out there wants to do a study on that, would be great.
I've thought about why there are fewer studies of cold showers than cold immersion. And I think the answer to my mind is that from a methodological standpoint, it's just harder to do, because if people are getting into cold water up to the neck, they're getting into cold water up to the neck. Whereas if people are getting into a cold shower, some people are larger or smaller. Some people are going to stand under the shower with it hitting their head, some people the back of the neck. You could direct people to do it, but it's a little bit more difficult. Also, I think for you and I are both research scientists, there's a little bit of a methodological challenge that might seem silly to people, but it's a real one, which is if people are in a cold shower, also the water is going to be kind of pushing their clothing against their skin. There's a certain vulnerability in for most people coming to a laboratory in the first place, let alone being observed while they shower. Whereas when you get into cold immersion, you're getting under the water. And, some people might roll their eyes and say, okay, really? Is that the barrier? But, science exists in these real world contexts. And this will vary by culture and things of that sort. But we run human subjects in my lab. And I'll tell you just the process of getting people to the laboratory and having them park and find the lab. And, it's a whole new environment with people in lab coats and people moving around, and where's the restroom? I mean, there's a certain amount of stress just associated with taking part in a study for most human subjects. So I totally agree. However, we need more studies of cold showers. It's just a harder environment to control in my mind. So it sounds like any form of cold to the skin that people register as what you called a cold shock or uncomfortable, like this is kind of jarring, activates the brown fat. Do we know what the pathway is from cold receptors on the skin to the brown fat? I mean, how does the brown fat know that we're cold?
Yeah, really good question. And it seems that I think that, of course, in the future, we will know much more about these pathways. But what we do know is that the cold receptors will send a signal to our temperature regulating center in the brain, so hypothalamus. And that's gonna be taking in this message. And we have so many cold receptors in the skin, so it's gonna be very fast. As you can say, if you immerse the body into cold water, this is gonna be so rapid. So it will have a rapid increase in neurotransmitters in the brain, so noradrenaline, adrenaline, and cortisol, and which is not that much, but it's still there. So you have this increase in noradrenaline, which will then immediately activate the brown fat, because you can say the activator is the most potent one, cold and noradrenaline, and that's going to activate the brown fat. But there's also a direct pathway from the cold receptors in the skin to the brown fat, which really shows that because of these different pathways, it shows that it could be that this tissue to keep us warm was developed in our evolvement as humans to keep us warm and to save us whenever the temperature on our skin varies just a little bit, to keep us in that right homeostatic balance so we don't get hypothermic, but also so we don't get hyperthermic, because it seems that the brown fat is also activated when we get warmer on our skin. So it's also maybe a temperature regulator in our body. But the pathway is different. I think it's also a third pathway directly from the muscles. So the brown fat is also activated even though the muscles are starting to shiver. So there's an extra pathway that way to keep our temperature up. So muscles and brown fat are working together to keep us warm, so we don't suffer too much in the cold water.
It's super interesting. And what I hear you pointing to is the existence of 3 parallel pathways. And this notion of parallel pathways comes up over and over again in biology, as you and I know. And I mean, I think it's important for people to know about, because as you said so eloquently, when something is very important to our survival or evolution, the brain and body install multiple mechanisms for it, not just one. And so it sounds like it's cold on the skin triggers a response in the hypothalamus, which then activates brown fat. Cold receptors in the skin directly to the brown fat, and then shivering in the muscle to the brown fat. I want to talk about brown fat in depth and learn from you more about brown fat. Before that, however, I want to ask about shiver. I've heard that shiver causes the release of succinate, which then activates the brown fat. Is it known whether or not inducing shiver is important? And when should people shiver? I mean, I've gotten into cold plunges and shivered while I was in there. And then I've also had the experience of getting into a cold plunge or a cold shower, then getting out, or even standing outside on a warm day after swimming in a pool and then starting to shiver. So the shiver comes later. So how important is shiver, and does it matter when shiver happens?
Yeah, well, shivering is good because that increases your metabolism, and that's going to burn some calories in your body. You shouldn't be so afraid of shivering, I think, because the shivering, as long as you don't get too hypothermic, so if you don't sit in the cold water for too long, sure. And what you just said by shivering after you get up, that is because of the after drop. Something called the after drop is when your core temperature decreases even after you get out of the cold water. And it always does that, your body, because as soon as you get into the cold water, all your blood vessels is going to constrict, because you need to keep your blood in your core and keep your vital organs warm. So as soon as you get up, those blood vessels will open again, and the warm blood will flow out and get colder and then flow back again into the core. And that's going to decrease the temperature in your core, of course.
So that's the drop.
So that's the drop.
Got it. Oh, I'm so glad you explained that. I've heard years ago, Wim Hof, I heard him talk about the drop, and I've heard colleagues of mine talk about the drop, but that's the first time I've ever heard it explained clearly. Let me make sure I understand this. So I get into cold water. Obviously, I'm cold. Vessels constrict to keep blood near the center of my body, keep me alive. I get out. The warming up of my body allows those vessels and capillaries to dilate again. The blood goes out to the surface, but the surface is still cold. And so that blood is cooled, and then my core body temperature drops. And that's what you're referring to as the drop. And that's what induces shiver.
Exactly.
Great. And then, am I right in thinking that then the shiver activates brown fat, which then warms me up again?
Yes.
Got it.
That's why you should end on the cold. But we can get back to that.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Yes. Ending on cold is, it's what I refer to as, and what has now become known as, the Soberg principle, which is a really important principle about the importance of ending on cold, and not doing what I do, which is to get into a hot shower or back in the sauna. But we'll get back to that in a few minutes. So that's wonderful that you can explain that so clearly, because I think that shiver is something that a lot of people do avoid. People think, oh, I don't want that. The chattering of the teeth, and it feels like a loss of bodily control, which really it is. It's an autonomic response.
Yeah, but I don't think that people should avoid it that much. It's just like seeing shivering as a way of your body in a like it's training. It's training for all your cells. It's training for your muscles. It's training of your metabolism, and that's going to increase your what's called the insulin sensitivity. So if you can like in your mind get used to the thought of shivering is just like when you go exercising in the training center and get that feeling of like, oh, this is tough. Now it hurts a little bit. Yeah, it's going to hurt because that's what shivering also does. But it's just a different way of training your cells in your body. It's going to create what is healthy stress. It's called hormesis in the cells. And the more you expose your muscle cells or your brown fat cells to these kind of like healthy stresses, exercise, cold and heat exposure, it's going to make them better at like activating and also at keeping you healthy. So as long as the cells get exposed to this, it's going to keep them on its toes, you can say, because it becomes more robust, increasing these heat shock proteins and cold shock proteins in the cells to make you more robust for the next time. And that is also what happens when you go to the training center. And I keep like drawing that parallel because people today know more about exercise and what that's is going to do to your muscle cells. But the same kind of like training is also what you do when you go out and into the cold water and submerge into cold water, because that is just your cold training center, you can say that. And also your heat training center going into the sauna, because the cells are getting stronger with hormetic stress. So it's the same process, just different praxis.
I'm so glad that you brought up the fact that the discomfort or the embarrassment or both of shiver is still crucial to actually to reach for and try and experience, the same way that with exercise. I think a lot of people don't realize this, but when we did our series with Dr. Andy Galpin, it became clear to me what should have already been clear to me, and I think that most people don't realize, which is that if we were to measure heart rate, blood pressure, stress hormones, and inflammation in a human being during exercise, it would look as if they were ready to die. Blood pressure would be high, inflammation is through the roof, but all of that is setting in motion an adaptation or set of adaptations that allow blood pressure to be lower at rest, that allow inflammation markers to be lower at rest, all the things that everybody is seeking with exercise, in addition to, of course, the aesthetic changes that people are seeking with exercise. It sounds like the exact same things are happening with the cold. So the redundant message here seems to be that the more discomfort, provided it's done safely, just like with exercise, the more shivering, the more cold shock, provided it's not to the extreme and stops somebody's heart, right? We can talk about thresholds for that a little bit later. It sounds like all of that is going to set in motion some long-term changes that will make people feel better and will improve health. Could you just touch on a few of the longer-term changes that are known to occur? I mean, I'm well aware of the study showing that, I think it was European Journal of Physiology. It was the European Journal of Physiology showing long-lasting increases in catecholamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine for many hours after deliberate cold exposure. What are some of the other things that happen at the level of metabolism and brown fat in, let's say, the hours and day after deliberate cold exposure?
As soon as you go in, of course, there's an activation. But it seems like, no, you're asking for the later outcomes like blood pressure and stuff like that. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, blood pressure, but also in terms of metabolism. I know that, in your study, you should, and we'll talk about brown fat in depth here in a moment, but that there were changes to the brown fat that equate to changes in, for instance, people's ability to be comfortable in colder environments when they're not doing deliberate cold exposure. Or in the same way that I can exercise on an exercise bike or go out for a hard run, but then if I go hiking with the family on Sunday and it's a steep climb, I could do that steep climb more easily because I'm quote unquote fit as a consequence of the exercise. What are some of the fitness adaptations of deliberate cold exposure?
Yeah, so what happens is that you get adapted a little bit every time you go. So you will, like exercise, get a little bit stronger. So every time you go into the cold water, for every time you will be more exposed to it, you will feel more comfortable in the cold. So you're gonna build your adaptation, which happens on a metabolic level, which is gonna be the brown fat. So you will have more activation of your brown fat. The mitochondria in the brown fat cells are going to be, you'll have more of those, and they will be more efficient at heating you up because the body expects you to do this again, so you are prepared in a way. The capillaries in your skin will also become better at like constricting, so you will have a better shield of your body to prepare you for the next time. So you will become better at going into the cold water in that way. So the body makes these mechanisms and changes your body in a way so you can expose yourself to the next time, right? And also you will have your stress response will also be subside a bit, so you will have a less increase of your catecholamines with time. With time, also, you have, because of this activation of your brown fat or your muscles, you will have an increase in your metabolism, which will then make your insulin sensitivity better. And this is shown in studies. For example, there's this interesting study I found just before I started my PhD, which was from Giborstormer et al. From 2016, where they measured metabolism. Not on brown fat, but they measured insulin sensitivity in middle-aged men and women during one winter swimming season. So they were not very young like they were in my study, but they were middle-aged, and I think this is very interesting. So during these 4 or 5 months they were winter swimming, they saw that they had a lower blood pressure after the season, and they had a lower heart rate, and they also saw that they have a better insulin sensitivity. And I think that is very interesting, because if you can have a better insulin sensitivity, you can prevent lifestyle diseases. So, and with lower blood pressure, which is a very strong outcome also for telling how much inflammation you have in the body. And because it didn't measure brown fat, I figured that it could be that was the missing link. That was one of the explanations to why we see this less inflammation in the body. So the longer outcomes, the long-term outcomes could be that you lower your blood pressure and you have a lower heart rate. You also have a better insulin sensitivity and a better glucose balance, but that is shown in my study.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens, now called AG1, is a vitamin mineral probiotic drink that covers all of your foundational nutritional needs. I've been taking Athletic Greens since 2012, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring the podcast. The reason I started taking Athletic Greens and the reason I still take Athletic Greens once or usually twice a day is that it gets me the probiotics that I need for gut health. Our gut is very important. It's populated by gut microbiota that communicate with the brain, the immune system, and basically all the biological systems of our body to strongly impact our immediate and long-term health. And those probiotics in Athletic Greens are optimal and vital for microbiotic health. In addition, Athletic Greens contains a number of adaptogens, vitamins, and minerals that make sure that all of my foundational nutritional needs are met, and it tastes great. If you'd like to try Athletic Greens, you can go to athleticgreens.com/Huberman, and they'll give you 5 free travel packs that make it really easy to mix up Athletic Greens while you're on the road, in the car, on the plane, etc. And they'll give you a year's supply of vitamin D3 K2. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Huberman to get the 5 free travel packs and the year's supply of vitamin D3 K2. And we'll get back to the insulin sensitivity and glucose balance. That's an impressive list of benefits. Blood pressure, of course, most people are aware of blood pressure and what it is. It's what they measure when we go to the doctor. And it's not very sexy nowadays. Blood pressure, people go, blood pressure. It's not, people want to hear about the inflammatome and the microbiome, and all of that stuff is really interesting. But I think that blood pressure doesn't get enough attention. And we have spoken to, on this podcast, to Dr. Pt2, who is an expert in longevity and health span and things of that sort. And I was surprised to learn, again, I shouldn't have been surprised, that the number one reason people die worldwide is cerebral vascular disease and cardiovascular disease. Yeah. And there are basically 3 things on the list of things to address. One is not smoking, or vaping, by the way, not smoking. There are a few other things related to blood markers, ApoB and things of that sort. But then the big one is blood pressure. And so it's interesting because we don't think about blood pressure that much anymore as the kind of people interested in health optimization and health, but blood pressure is so vital to control. So it's wonderful to hear that deliberate cold exposure is one way to control blood pressure. I'm guessing in concert with other forms of exercise.
Yeah.
Let's talk about brown fat. And if you're willing, I'd love to drill into brown fat at a deep level. Again, my understanding of this is far more elementary than yours. Obviously, you're the expert. My understanding about brown fat is that it's located in specific areas of our body, maybe more widespread than when I learned in school. I was taught it was just at the clavicles and the back of the neck and upper back, but who knows? I learned that there's more of it when we're children, maybe more distributed throughout our body, and that it's rich in mitochondria. But what is so special about the brown fat? Like, if we could just go into the biology of brown fat a little bit, what does it look like? You've measured it in human subjects. Where is it distributed really? Can it expand its distribution? Can we activate and expand the amount of brown fat as adults? And for those of you that are cringing already, thinking we're talking about getting fatter, it's quite the opposite. We're talking about not subcutaneous fat, but fat located around the organs. But please educate me, tell me where I'm wrong, and expand my knowledge on brown fat.
Okay. Yeah, you are not wrong, but it's true that there are more locations of the brown fat than we previously thought. There's this very nice study from 2017 by Leitner et al., where they had made these Pt2 overlays of their subjects, where they can see where in the body do we have brown fat and where can we grow more brown fat, so to say. So the brown fat is very plastic, so it means that it can grow and it can decrease, and this is proven in studies where we have seen people with pheochromocytoma. It's like a very specific cancer type where from the 70s, where we can see that if they have this specific kind of cancer type, they have this tumor on the adrenal gland. So they have like a huge increase in noradrenaline. And because of that, they have this continuous activation of the brown fat. And they have grown a lot of brown fat in the whole body, or abdomen, or where it's located in these 6 different places. But it is just like very much compared to like normal people. And what they then see, what we learn from this study, is that brown fat can apparently grow if you have an increase in noradrenaline in the body. It's not like you want that, because when that happens, you have a high blood pressure. You don't want it chronically, right? You just want it on like a short amount of time, and then it can grow for a bit, but you don't want it chronically, of course not. But because it activates also your sympathetic nervous system. So they have also showed they had high blood pressure. They lost a lot of weight, of course, because this is activating your metabolism. So they found, luckily, that when they remove this benign tumor, that the brown fat decreases again to normal size, and they gain weight again, and they had normal blood pressure. So the story ends well. But it's kind of like proof of concept of that brown fat can actually grow. So it's plastic in its way of like it can grow and it can decrease again. So that's very good studies to see what the body is capable of. But we don't, of course, want all that brown fat. We just want it to be, we just want to keep it, actually, and keep it activated. Because what we see in studies is also that after the age of 40, studies have shown that there is an association with having less brown fat, but increased obesity. So, of course, we don't know yet whether brown fat decreases with age and therefore we get obese, or we get obese and therefore we have less brown fat. But as brown fat is an insulin sensitive organ in our body, and we get obese, just like the muscles get less sensitive, insulin sensitive, the brown fat does as well, and therefore it maybe decreases. It could be a theory that I think could be one of the reasons why we don't see that much brown fat in elderly people. Some have a lot, especially people working outside. There are studies showing this.
People who
work outside,
do physical work outside. Farmers,
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. They expose themselves to it, so they'll just keep it in that way.
It's and I suppose we should clarify for people in case they don't know that insulin sensitivity is a very good thing. You want
Yeah.
that. You want your cells to be sensitive to insulin. Insulin insensitivity is type 2 diabetes, and is associated with obesity. So just a point of clarification there. Yeah, it's interesting to me. I usually work out at home, but I go to a gym once or twice a week if I can, because it's good if I see the outside world. And there are a few individuals at the gym who they're not particularly large or muscular, but they are incredibly lean, and their posture is great, presumably from the musculoskeletal work. And they're in their 70s and 80s. I mean, it's remarkable, right?
Yeah,
and I know all the telltale signs of hormone augmentation. I'm very good at spotting that. There are a few telltale signs. I've talked about this on other podcasts, and that's not why they're fit. They're clearly of that look, and you see this outside the gym too, of course, for people that look like they've done a lot of physical labor their whole life.
Yeah.
They're just moving a lot. They have strong hands and features, and they're not necessarily excessively lean, but you can tell that they've been using their musculoskeletal system. And I like to talk to these people and ask them, like, not what are you doing now for your workout, but what did you grow up doing? And I would say, and obviously I haven't run statistics on this, but more than 75% of them respond that they grew up on a farm, or that they did some sort of manual labor, or were a postman or a postwoman, or doing something where they moved a lot for their early years and throughout middle age. And most of them are now in retirement, but some of them are still working, and they all still moving a lot. So the relationship between shiver and brown fat makes sense to me. But is it the case that as we're just moving around, I've heard of NEAT, non-exercise induced thermogenesis. So if we're just moving around, that we are activating brown fat, or does there need to be this stressor? Does there need to be shiver and a cold stimulus or a heat stimulus to activate the brown fat? In other words, is just staying active enough, or do we need to do some sort of temperature shock type thing, like deliberate cold exposure?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question, because how also, why do we have this tissue? Then if it has to be extreme, then you can question what do we need this tissue for? But it seems that you can activate the brown fat with just a little bit of exposure to cold. So cold is the most potent stressor activator of our brown fat, because it's our temperature regulating organ in our body. So first responder to that. So the muscles will be a little bit too late, and therefore we have maybe these two kind of tissues. So actually, just exposing yourself or a hand actually just to cold water. So studies have shown that if you just put your hand in cold water, not that you're gonna do that all day or every day or anything. It's not something you have to do, but it just shows that you can activate your brown fat just by getting a temperature change on your skin. So you can go outside in a t-shirt. That's why also we were just talking about, well, people who works outside or move a lot or get out, in and out of it, like changing the temperature of their body all the time, they will have more brown fat. And activating that is going to keep your metabolism higher and your insulin sensitivity. A study have also shown this. So the brown fat can be activated as soon as you just change your temperature in the skin. So going outside in a t-shirt, wearing cooling vests, also studies have shown this for 10 days. It's going to also grow your brown fat. So you can get more brown fat if you expose yourself to the cold. You don't have to start in a cold shower. You don't have to start in a cold plunge if you're not really ready for that yet. But just exposing yourself to the cold wind has also shown to activate your brown fat. Or if you don't want to be like in this awake state, then you can also just sleep in the cold. And you won't notice it that much maybe. But studies have shown that if you sleep in 19 degrees Celsius, then you will activate your brown fat and you will grow your brown fat. So you have more of it. So this very nice studies from Hansen et al. From 2017 showed that a group of subjects who slept in a room at 24 degrees, and then they made this PET-CT scannings to see how much brown fat do they have from the beginning, so what we call baseline. Then they measured again after a month of sleeping in 19 degrees, and they saw, I think it's remarkable, just 1 month at 19 degrees sleeping there. They had a duvet on, and they were still had clothes on when we're sleeping.
So they're under a cover, under a duvet?
Under a duvet, yeah.
Okay.
The subjects were sleeping at 19 degrees for 1 month, had increased his insulin sensitivity. The next month, they slept at 24 degrees. They measured this again, and then they had decreased actually a little bit. And then they slept at 27 degrees, so quite warm room actually for the fourth month, and they saw even less activation of the brown fat and also insulin sensitivity. So it seems that you can expose yourself, and pretty rapidly the brown fat will respond to this because it's so sensitive to noradrenaline, right? So if you keep exposing yourself to a little bit of cold, you will also get a little bit adapted to it, but that's because the brown fat has grown these more mitochondria in the cells. So these small energy fabrics, that's going to activate the cells, and that's going to take up glucose and fat from the fatty acids from the bloodstream to keep the thermogenesis up. And that's going to clear up some sugar, and it's going to clear so in the bloodstream, and some fat as well. So the brown fat can in that way decrease our unhealthy fat, which is the white fat. And the white fat is what we don't want too much of, but we still need some, of course. And it's our energy storage, so it's very important that it's there. We just don't need a lot of it. So on our thighs and also around our inner organs, that's where it's located. So if we can have activation of the brown fat just by going out in the cold and just by sleeping in a cold room, or if you have courage for it, you can go out and expose yourself in a cold plunge. Cold showers is also going to do the trick. So you can do different variations of this. Just exposing yourself to various temperatures is going to activate the brown fat because it was involved to keep us in a perfect homeostatic balance regarding temperature. So to keep us alive.
Incredible. I want to just get a clarification around this 19 degrees Celsius room that they're sleeping in. So they're under a comforter, a duvet, and you mentioned they had clothes on. The room is 19 degrees Celsius, but the temperature underneath their blanket might not be 19 degrees Celsius. So presumably it's the cold on their face that's activating the increase in brown fat that was observed. Is that a reasonable expectation?
I think so, yeah, because you have so many co-receptors in your face, so it's enough. And I think it corresponds very well with the studies showing that you can activate the brown fat just by putting a hand into a bucket of cold water. Mm-hmm. And I did this experiment myself in my studies just to see how well did they respond to cold water. So it was 4 degrees Celsius cold water for 4 minutes. And then I just measured blood pressure and heart rate to see, do they have like an activation of this? I actually also measured the brown fat during this cold exposure for 4 minutes with an infrared thermography camera to see, can I see that the brown fat is activated? And just to go back to the location of the brown fat. So usually you cannot really see activation of your brown fat because it's located centrally in around your central nervous system. And the biggest depot, as you mentioned before, is up here under the clavicular bones. So, and very close to the skin surface. And because it's so close to the skin surface, I could measure it with this very expensive camera. Yeah, and it's not very feasible for people to go home and do this. Don't, because it takes a lot of practice, I can tell. But we measured the brown fat with this, and I could see that after a few minutes that the activation was there, an increase in temperature arose from that activation, just 4 minutes. So it's very rapid. And I'm also measured in my study how deep was the brown fat under your skin. So it's very close to the surface, which also shows that it needs to be there to heat you up and heat your inner organs.
Well, I'm delighted to hear all of this, and I'll tell you why. One is by way of anecdote. I mentioned a little bit earlier that as an undergraduate, I worked in a lab that studied thermogenesis, and we were doing that in animals, but we had this room that was very cold. Uh-huh. The whole room was cold. The guy who I worked for at the time, and Harry Carlisle, is a very accomplished physiologist. He came from this lineage. I don't know if this literature is still discussed much, but it's a beautiful literature from Rothwell and Stock. They were the ones who discovered non-exercise induced thermogenesis. The fact that people who bounce their legs a lot and move around a lot and have a lot of kind of stochastic movement burn up to 1,800 calories more per day than people who sit more still.
Fascinating.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Just incredible. I don't think that work gets as much attention as it deserves. Published in journals like Nature, so very fine journals. But in any event, one of the things that I noticed when I started working in that laboratory was that I was cold because the room was cold. And Dr. Carlisle, Harry, said, well, the key is to wear a t-shirt in here for about 2 or 3 days, and then you will cold adapt. I thought, well, wouldn't I want to put on a hoodie and get warm in there so I was comfortable? And he said, no, actually what you want to do is get yourself uncomfortably cold, activate your brown fat. And indeed, when I did that, I think it was just 2 days of being in that cold environment. Then I could come back on the third day and be perfectly comfortable because the brown fat had expanded or added mitochondria or both. And I was perfectly comfortable in that environment. I also got very, very lean in those days and weeks. Now, I've never been somebody who's very lean, nor am I somebody who carries a lot of excess adipose tissue. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I'm sure I could adjust that with feeding if I want to, but it was striking what a powerful effect it had on my entire system of thermal regulation. And one of the things that I also delighted in when Cell Reports Medicine published your study is they had an accompanying press release that went out to those of us that receive press releases. And it described a saying in Scandinavia, which is essentially, I'm not going to attempt to speak Danish, even though I have much of my family is in Denmark, believe it or not, from Denmark. We have a lot of Danes in my family. I won't embarrass myself by trying to speak Danish as I did before the microphones were rolling. But that there's a saying that I think essentially translates to, in the fall, when you're approaching winter, you want to actually wear fewer layers, not bundle up when you go outside, so that you can prepare yourself for the cold of winter and be able to heat yourself up using your brown fat. And that in the spring, as the temperatures are warming, rather than removing layers, you want to wear more layers in order to be a little bit uncomfortably warm, so that in the heat of the summer, you're better at cooling your body. Do I have that right? And maybe, do you know the saying, and would you be willing to share it? Only the Swedes and Danes will be able to understand. Maybe the Norwegians too. If you don't know it, that's okay.
Yeah, so I know the concept of it, because we say it. You should wear less before winter and more before summer.
Oh, so, well, there it is in English. So it doesn't have to be esoteric. But okay.
Yeah, and you're completely right. And I think this is this is just something that we know in the Scandinavian countries. I think that we intuitively know this. But if we just go back a little bit in history, I think that around the 1950s, the Russian government went out and said, well, we should do something about the tuberculosis pandemic or epidemic that was at this time. So they wanted to have the people be more resilient to the cold and also increase our immune system. So in Scandinavia, and actually also in Russia, we put our babies outside to sleep in the prom. And that is like to also to get more resistant to the cold, but also to increase our immune system. And we still do that in Denmark. So do
you really?
Yeah, we do.
Babies are taken out in the cold?
In the snow, in frosty rain, everything. My 2 boys have been sleeping out in winter, or at least their first 3, 4, 5 years, because it's like very good for them, and they get a better immune system and get resilient to the cold, so they will have less colds. And also, they run around in a t-shirt when it's super cold because they have activated all their brown fat. I didn't understand at that time, I must say, but I kind of like intuitively also knew, because we have inherited this way of doing things with our culture. So, and I have heard people coming from the US saying Danes are crazy. They put their babies outside in proms and leave them there, and then they go inside and drink coffee on the cafes.
Well, I don't think Danes are crazy. I adore the Danes. No. They're amazing culture and people. I'm so fortunate to have family members from Denmark. But I did notice, so when we were in Copenhagen, and I know we saw you there not long ago. That was June. The water in the harbor was cold.
Yeah.
For even though the Pacific is close to here, which is very cold. It felt pretty cold. But it was summertime-ish. So people were in summertime mode, right? T-shirts and shorts and things that sort. But it did strike me that people in Copenhagen are dramatically fitter than they are in the United States. I mean, first of all, everyone's bicycling everywhere.
Yeah.
Not many people wearing sunglasses. So trying to extract as much photon energy from the sun as possible, which I support. As everyone knows, I'm a big fan of getting sun. But also, when we did see swimmers, they were swimming in this cold water and like it was nothing. And the range and age of the swimmers was what was remarkable. You saw the kind of fit triathlete looking types, but also young kids, like really young kids. And then people probably in their 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s. Yeah. Really remarkable. Vastly different than what you see if you go to the ocean here in Los Angeles or elsewhere. So you Scandinavians are onto something with this. I'd like to take a quick break and thank our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. I've long been a believer in getting regular blood work done for the simple reason that many of the factors that impact your immediate and long-term health can only be assessed with a quality blood test. The problem with a lot of blood and DNA tests out there, however, is that they'll give you information about certain lipid markers or hormone markers, but no information about what to do with all of that data. Inside Tracker makes it very easy to look at your levels of hormones, metabolic factors, lipids, etc., and then to assess what sorts of behavioral, nutritional, supplementation, or perhaps other interventions you might want to use in order to bring those numbers into the ranges that are optimal for your health. Inside Tracker's ultimate plan now includes 3 new hormone markers that are critical to measure during a woman's reproductive and menopausal years. These are estradiol, progesterone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can go to insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Again, that's insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off. I'd like to talk about your study. If you could give us a little bit of the backdrop about what motivated that study. And then walk us through what you did, who the subjects were, what you had them do, what you measured, in as much detail as you would like to share, because I think it's such an important, even fair to say landmark study, because it also explored not just cold, but sauna and the co-use of cold and sauna as a way to probe metabolism and brown fat and other markers as well. And as you do this, I'm hoping at some point that you might tell us some of the observations that you might have made that interested you that perhaps were not in the paper, because that's one of the great benefits of sitting across from somebody who did the work in detail. So if you could tell us about your study and what you did and what you discovered.
Thank you for that question, Andrew. I love to also explain a little bit what did we do, because when people read this kind of paper, they just see the numbers. They don't see what happened before that. And human studies are very different from my study. My studies, you can do a knockout of something and then everything is perfectly matched and controlled. Doing human studies is very far different from that, because people are different even in the groups. So yeah, but what we when I started this research in 2016, I did not really know what the brown fat was. So I started reading up on all this, and I was very interested in preventive medicine. Also, the studies that I did before brown fat was also very much in the preventive side, how can we, that was about something else, but the sweet tooth and how can we lower our sweet tooth and stuff like that. So, but after that, I wanted to do something new. So I looked into the brown fat, got hired in this fantastic research group where it's a cell group. So they mostly did cell studies, and they didn't have anyone to do a human study yet. But they really wanted me to do that. So I read upon a lot of research about how does the brown fat get activated, what have been done already. And I mentioned the paper before with sleeping in the cold. I found that particular paper very fascinating. And that was also where, at that time, I was like, okay, so cold exposure as an intervention of sleeping in the cold could be a good thing to go out and say, well, people do this. But on the other hand, first of all, it was already done. That was one thing. But the other thing was well, I wanted to see if we can do some kind of activity so we can have people move also, or go and do something together, whatever. And the cold made us think about, well, what about winter swimming? And it was kind of like a bit of a joke in the beginning. It's like, winter swimming, yeah, it's going to activate the brown fat, right? but when we read the literature, we couldn't really find anything about activation of the brown fat with cold water, besides hand in a bucket of cold water. That was already there. So we were just thinking, okay, so it should be very potent activation of the brown fat if it's cold water, but very different from cold air. So it was kind of also a new thing we were going into, and we knew that we were going to do like a more of a proof of concept study at the beginning of it, because it was like winter swimmers must, in theory, activate the brown fat, right? But we kind of didn't really know was this kind of stressor too much, too little, or what will happen actually. But we had this idea about, well, we always say that cold water, winter swimming will activate your metabolism, but do we know if it does that? No, we don't. So, and while this idea was a little bit fun at the beginning, we kind of accepted. It was like, okay, let's just try this out. But because we didn't have the funding for it, we was like, okay, let's do a proof of concept study. Let's go with a small number, but enough to see a difference between the groups. So the power calculation of that study is done on what we know from PET-CT scannings of the brown fat. So that's the main outcome of that, of course. So, and we wanted to go a little bit small on the numbers of participants, because we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the different mechanisms and also redo some of the days. So I really wanted to do that to see if I can replicate also the findings. And that's going to take a lot of funding, but it's also going to take a lot of time to do it. So the proof of concept was just going small, but looking at different mechanisms. We also took fat biopsies, for example, and looked at the white fat to see if there was any differences between the groups before and after and stuff like that. So that's kind of like how it started. And the first year was like a field study for me. So I was not a winter swimmer when I started this. It was just...
Oh, really?
No, I wasn't at all. And I would say I was a bit afraid of the cold myself. Bit of a cold sissy, always cold, having big socks on and sweaters and stuff like that. So I was like, I am so comfortable. I'm just like everybody else, very comfortable. I like being completely temperature neutral. But I started like playing with this thought, like, well, if this is so healthy, in theory, I should not pack myself up. I should start not doing that. Yeah. But the first year observation of winter swimmers on the jetty, they kind of joked about it, say, come on, Susanne, you need to try this. You cannot study this unless you have tried it. And I was like, haha, very funny. Of course I can do that. But I couldn't. I read the literature. I understood in theory what happens when you go into cold water, but I completely understood it when I first tried it. The first few times, not so funny. It felt painful. It was just like running too long after a long break, and your muscles hurt the day after, right? You completely regret that you took that extra mile.
What about when you say uncomfortable, you mean uncomfortable when you got in and when you were in, or uncomfortable afterwards? Because I find that on rare occasions, well, I should just, full disclosure, I do deliberate cold exposure every morning for about a minute to 2 minutes in a cold plunge. There are days that I miss, but when I'm at home, I do that. And when I travel, I do a cold shower. I do finish with a warm shower. So, and we'll talk about why that's probably not the best idea. But, and I've been doing it for some years now, on and off. So just full disclosure, I'm a devotee. And I have family members that, hate the cold, but have gotten into it and are starting to like it, but they don't. And I don't necessarily like the experience in the cold water, but I love the way I feel when I get
After.
out. And I'm 100% on that statement about loving it when I get out. Occasionally it feels good to be in there. It feels invigorating. And I think I've learned to control the gasp reflex and the hyperventilation. And I just have told myself what we know, which is that the forebrain struggles to engage for the first 20 or 30 seconds. But if you can get past that wall, it's far easier to push through. But when you say that it was really uncomfortable, do you mean the experience of getting in, or you also felt lousy afterward?
Yeah, and very important to clear that out. I only felt very uncomfortable doing it at the moment. But afterwards, the first time I went with a group, and actually my husband was there as well, because I really wanted someone I knew coming along, because it's very normal. If you haven't done this before, you feel a little bit anxious about it. This is shown in studies as well, because blood pressure and heart rate goes up in those who are new to this kind of activity. So I was a little bit anxious about it. So it was really uncomfortable just doing it. But afterwards, as soon as I got up, I felt fantastic. Mm-hmm. And we went into the sauna, and I did 3 rounds because I just loved it. I love the feeling afterwards, because you have all these neurotransmitters going in your brain, and you feel more positive. I feel invigorated. I had so much energy, and that, like, I could totally see why people would do this to get energy throughout the day, because I definitely had that. I didn't have to do 3 dips to get that. I think 1 would be enough, and I often do that also now today. I do 1 dip. Sometimes I do 2 or 3 dips in 1 round, you can say in 1 day, but often it's like just 1 or 2 times a week. For me, that is enough to get that energy and to get that positive feeling. And I think that is also why I put up my study in that way. I wanted to study the lowest dose, you can say, the lowest amount that we can get away with, but still see health benefits. So what I observed there on the jetty was that some did it a long time. They were in the water for a very long time. And to me, it seemed maybe a little bit extreme.
Could you give me an example of long time?
Well, so maybe they were like really swimming, and they could be 20 minutes or half an hour.
That's a long time.
That's a long time. And there was like ice, and people who came up. I mean, I just didn't really feel that this is something that I wanted to go out and recommend to people after my PhD.
You didn't want any research subjects dying either, because if you're not adapted, I mean,
No.
people can do that. Also, a 20-minute cold shower or 20-minute cold plunge. I know people do it, but it's probably not a good idea.
No, probably not. It's going to exhaust your cells and make them age too fast. Mm-hmm. So exactly, that's when you pass that hormetic stress, the healthy stress level, that's what is happening. The quite opposite is almost chronic stress actually in the cells. Well, what happened then was that I found out that if I want to have this protocol get through ethical committee, I really needed to go like very like sleek with the not too long and make sure that they were also very healthy and to get approval, of course, of this study. But what I did was to recruit winter swimmers who already have been swimming for 2 or 3 seasons. And I just observed them. I said, I'm not going to do an intervention study yet. I did that after, but I wanted to do like a proof of concept where they were already adapted to the cold, and then compare them to a matched control group who were matched on you can say diet. So were they vegetarian or not? And one of them was in each group. Also,
they weren't all vegetarians.
No. Okay. Just one in each group. Yeah.
I was going to say, with all the amazing fish and meat in Denmark, I'd have a hard time being a vegetarian.
Yeah.
The breads are amazing, the fruits and vegetables too. But okay, so there were a couple vegetarians in each group.
Yeah, one in each. Yeah.
Okay.
And they were matched
Token vegetarian. I have family members who are vegetarian, so I'm just poking fun.
Yeah, but they were matched on different things. So what we usually match them on is also BMI. We chose one gender in this study, and we would always choose both men and women normally, but we do see that there are different brown fat levels depending on gender. So women have more brown fat than men.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.
That deserves study.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why, actually? I think it's interesting because women are also smaller, so in size and mass, right? But they also have a lower peripheral temperature, especially on hands and ears.
Is that right? That's documented that women do run colder than men?
Yeah. And there's
physiologically, I didn't say psychologically.
No.
We won't go to the psychological cold heat. Yeah.
That's different.
Yeah.
Something else.
That's a different podcast.
Yeah. Another time. So women are just colder physically. So on hands and ears, it's measured on that. And feet as well. So compared to men. And men have bigger hearts than women, and they can pump out more blood peripheral than in a woman's body. So that could be an explanation for the colder hands, for example. thermocomfortable state is also different between genders. So men are more comfortable at 22 degrees Celsius, and women are thermocomfortable at 24 degrees Celsius. And this
Okay,
is
so the thermostat wars of home have been now validated.
Yes,
Okay.
there's a study.
2 degrees Celsius. By the way, prior to starting recording, I made the executive decision that we were going to go with Celsius throughout the podcast because the majority of the world uses Celsius. So for those of you that think in Fahrenheit, the internet is your friend in making those conversions. So we're sticking with Celsius. So men tend to be thermocomfortable at 22 degrees Celsius, women at 24. Okay, interesting.
Explains a lot about like also some arguments in the homes where men are turning down the heater and women are turning up the heater, and they cannot really. So it's really I'm on both sides here. I understand the men, we understand the women, but there is a difference there, which was also one of the reasons why we in this proof of concept study chose one gender. So it is not like only because we wanted to study men. It was just to eliminate all the confounding factors which could have an impact on our results. So that was one of the reasons. But also because so women have more brown fat than men, and otherwise we would have to like do 4 groups or something like that. And not having funding yet, we were like, okay, we need to do like just one group, just a control group, and then a group who were already winter swimmers. Mm-hmm. So I recruited winter swimmers who have been swimming for 2 to 3 seasons because I wanted them to be already adapted, but not going too long in the water. So they told me, I did a lot of screening here, of course, beforehand and interviews to ask them how much do you do and how long do you stay in the water? And I monitored how long did they then stay in the water and recruited based on that they only did like 2 to 3 times per week. It seems reasonable for Denmark at least to do that. And they stayed only in the water for 1 to 2 minutes. So the cold subsides very quickly and you will get this activation of